20 years doing development and then application security, information security, a bunch of different things. If you're really, really curious, you can, it's probably all broke out on LinkedIn somewhere. It just got so long, I quit putting it in presentations. So like Chris mentioned, I got involved in SAMM several years ago, and then a different long story ended up getting pulled into working on the OWASP Top 10 as well. So I do data related stuff for both of them. And structure and stuff like that. There's similarities between the two, so it actually works out pretty well. I can take lessons learned from both projects and like basically help with synergy between them. So what is SAMM? So SAMM is essentially a software assurance maturity model. So it's an open framework to try and help provide some structure to the complexity of application security. So the idea is you can use it to try and evaluate your existing practices. You can use it for guidance and essentially structure for trying to build a program. It helps you figure out, if I'm here, what would be next? What are other steps I can take? How are things related to each other? And then it'll help you measure being able to create metrics for programs. It gives you the ability to move up to the right if you need to, build dashboards and things so that you can actually show improvements in different ways. So you can tie different activities or different initiatives to being able to improve your score. And then in theory, you'd be able to take that and compare it against an industry average and be able to present to your management about how well you're doing comparing to your peers. And that part's coming. It's actually a lot harder to do with an open source project than it seems sometimes. So the SAMM team has grown a good bit over the last 3 years. So when we released SAMM 1.5, there were only probably 4 or 5 of us in the core. So now, in mostly US and Belgium. So now we have people from Germany and New Zealand, UK, Sweden, Uruguay, Argentina. It's a pretty good spread of experiences that we get to bring. So they all help because it also helps us with understanding how things are run in different parts of the world. So that helps SAMM not be super US centric, which I've run into before with other projects. So the history behind SAMM, so there's a reason why SAMM and BSIMM have similarities, and that's because they basically came out of the same origin. So back in March of 2009, having been in process for a couple of years, OpenSAMM was released. It was funded by Fortify, I believe, originally. And that initial model was put out, and it was 7 years before any updates were done to it. And to be honest, it was because the model had been so well thought out initially. But you also have to realize at that time, we were pre-agile, pre-DevOps, pre-all of that stuff. So it's a model, but it's very waterfall-centric. So the language in it, the processes and activities in it were more waterfall tuned because that's what we were doing at the time. So what I've been told was, because it was open, at some point, essentially SAMM was forked for BSIMM. So BSIMM started with a similar core or base that SAMM did, and then Cigital went off and took it into its direction to build BSIMM, which is now under Synopsys. So OpenSAMM is actually, and this is a cause for confusion, and I really wish I had a way to solve it, but I don't. The original primary author for OpenSAMM has requested to retain OpenSAMM, so he still has opensamm.org, even though technically OpenSAMM is still on 1.0. It hasn't been changed since it was released 11 years ago. Technically, OWASP SAMM is actually a fork of OpenSAMM because we have our own set of maintainers. So any of the current SAMM stuff you see is all out of the OWASP project. In 2016, we had gotten together. There was a number of consulting companies. We got together to rev SAMM and provide some updates to it. And then in 1.5, we made some changes that I'll talk about in a little bit in terms of how scoring is run to provide more granularity and more benefit to it. And then January of this year, we managed to release SAMM 2.0, which I'll talk about those differences as well, that introduced a fifth business function because of the way development's changed over the last 10 years. And then we're planning, we have a release schedule that we're hoping to release 2.1 in October, but that's mostly related to additional information and guidance for agile shops, and then also translations into multiple languages. So sometimes people ask why SAMM. So George Box, so he was I'm trying to remember. He was one of the great statistical minds in the 20th century. But he actually said, and I love his quotes, is that the most that can be expected from any model is it can supply a useful approximation to reality. So all models are wrong and some are useful. And what we hope to do with SAMM is we hope to make a useful model. It's not going to fit you 100%. It never will, and it can't. Software development is way too complex. And we have a lot of people who've decided that they need the ability to be artistic when they do development. And so developers like to be creative because that's, it's human nature. It's what they like to do. And we don't need to kill it because then we might as well just have machines write code. So every program is different because every organization is different. Every culture within an organization is different. You have different origins, different people running it with different experiences that like or dislike different technologies and frameworks. So you will never, or probably never, I try not to use absolutes, it would be really rare to find two identical organizations. So basically, we try and come up with a model that is the best approximation we can from what is out there and our collective experiences. So within SAMM, we have core principles that organizational behavior and cultural changes are slow. It takes a long time to make changes at an organization level, and we understand that. There's also no single recipe that works for everybody. So just because you find somebody has 2.2 on governance doesn't mean that's where you need to be. You have to figure out, and that's still one of the challenges that we try and help people figure out, but you need to figure out for your organizations, you have certain risk appetite, you have certain attack surfaces, you have certain goals, markets, that all changes what recipe works for your organization. And then guidance for activities, from our perspective, it needs to be prescriptive. People are out there trying to figure out, what can I do? What do I need to do? What might work for others? And then ideally, with all this complexity, we try and balance it out and try and make something that's relatively simple to consume, clearly defined, and then measurable. And so we've had questions before about why is SAMM balanced? So why is there 5 business functions with 3 security practices and 2 streams? And honestly, it's because humans have a tendency to seek out balance and symmetry. So while technically we could, and we did for a bit, we ran a scenario, it was like, what happens if we just made stuff up and things were really unbalanced? And we found that you would end up putting more emphasis in strange areas just because there was more things. And then scoring was incredibly difficult to try and keep things balanced. So it's balanced for a reason, and some things, and it's always a struggle with a model, right? How to make sure that things are weighted appropriately. And within SAMM specifically, we've taken the position at this point that we don't weight anything more heavily than anyone else because it's going to depend on your organization. So we've talked with some people before about they've tried to do weighting within their organization about different parts of SAMM that mean more to them. And that's fine. And we try to do what we can to allow that, to support people needing to weight things heavier on their side. So one of the things we introduced, so the early SAMM, if you've ever gone through the questions, they were a bunch of questions in a bunch of different areas, but they were all yes or no. The problem with yes or no questions is we know that things are not absolute when it comes to software development, and it's not that you either do or don't have something. So for instance, in education and guidance, there was an area about, hey, do you have customized role-based training for different employees that you have? So if you had, for instance, custom role-based training for a subset of developers, but not for management, not for project managers, not for anyone else, you answer yes or no. Because if you answer no, then you're not getting credit for work you're actually doing, and management might be like, why'd you answer no? I thought I paid for this program, this custom development or custom training for your developers. If you answered yes, then I've now forced you to lie that you're done and good, and you're not going to be able to get justification to be able to get additional training that you actually need because you've answered yes. So you're not going to move anything on a graph or move anything on a dashboard. So in 1.5, we actually introduced essentially a weighted assessment score. So the maturity levels have stayed the same since the beginning. You're from basically 0 to 3. Honestly, and people get surprised at this sometimes, honestly, most organizations I've ever run through SAMM are somewhere around 1, between about 0.8 and 1.2 for their initial scores. And honestly, I haven't run into any that have managed to get past about an overall 2.5. And those are pretty large organizations with large budgets. It's just incredibly difficult to get that advanced across the entire scope of what is software assurance. So within the answers to each questions, instead of yes to no, we basically tried to strike a balance, and the answers are a little different depending on the context of the question so that it still makes sense. But you have just no, like we've never touched it, never messed with it, and that's 0. You can get 0.2 for few or some, meaning we've played with it, we've started to roll it out somewhere, it's in a pilot. You can get 0.5 for that question if you say, hey, we've covered at least half of the applications within our organization with this particular area. Or if you can get all the way up to many or most. So notice it doesn't say all, because it's incredibly rare to honestly answer all for any of these things, because there's almost always somebody who isn't following that process, has an exception or something along those lines.
Yanni.
Question? Or all right, I think I'm hearing something. Also notice that you get more credit as you get better coverage. So the first jump is 0.2, the next is 0.3, and then 0.5. Because it's harder to get something fully embedded in your organization between halfway through and most of the way than it is to start something. So we generally, that's about the only weighting we have in here, is the understanding that as you try and scale something up, it definitely, there's more effort and you should be rewarded more for that. So in the 1.5 framework, so there's still a lot of people using 1.5 because 2.0 was just released in January. So at the base level, you had governance, construction, verification, and operations. So this was originally billed as like covering the software development lifecycle. But to be honest, if you look at it closely, most of an SDL is actually within construction and verification. Governance is generally outside of most SDL programs, and much of operations is actually considered out of most SDL programs. So if you looked at either waterfall or agile, most of those graphs, pictures, and whatever depictions, you would have starting from like concepts or user stories or voice of the customer, things like that. Well, that's down in the construction. That's well outside of governance. Governance is stuff that's much more policy level, your general strategy, compliance, education, things that are outside of the space of an SDL, but all have a direct impact on the SDL. Operations a lot of times gets put in a single box at the end that says support or something along those lines, if it's even in an SDL diagram. So as we went through and we were looking at what might need to change for 2.0, we realized that there's actually a major component of today's development cycles that isn't actually represented in here. So under construction, we have things like threat assessments, architecture requirements, all this stuff before you actually code. Verification has design reviews, implementation review, or code or configuration, and then testing, everything that's post-code. We realized that at the time we wrote this, there was a bunch of activities before coding and a bunch of activities after coding, but nothing for the process of coding. So that was one of the things that has really changed in the last 10 years. So when we looked at this, we decided, you know what makes sense, because of the way we're now doing builds and the way we're doing deployments, more of defect management, that kind of stuff. So we've actually added a 5th business function within SAMM. And then there's some pretty sizable changes in some of the other areas to try and balance things out. So you could, if you were still a waterfall shop, this still works. If you're an agile shop, this should work. If you're DevOps or, however, the idea was trying to build a model that you could apply regardless of what type of development lifecycle you were actually going through. So we know, and this is part of the reasons 2.0, this is somewhat of a breaking change from the back for the 1.x for SAMM. Now, there is still, the goal is, and I'll talk about it a little bit with the benchmark program, the goal is still to map as much as we can. So there's still a good bit that I can map between 2.0 and 1.5, and I plan to implement that. So, but there's also like the stuff related to implementation, most of that is brand new within 2. There's a few things from 1.5 that were pulled into that space, but it's mostly new. So I built this for AppSec Cali, I think. So this was really, like I mentioned, there's, for the structure of SAMM, there are now 5 business functions, but under that, there's 3 security practices for each function. So like under governance, you have strategy and metrics, policy and guidance, or policy and compliance, and education and guidance. But within those, you actually have 2 streams. And we just named them Stream A and Stream B. Because one of the things that was interesting was the original SAMM was built with a linear progression in mind. So you would always do all of the maturity level 1 stuff, and then 2, and then 3, and so on in a pure linear fashion. And that was also represented in the scoring. Like, you wouldn't get credit for anything you did at maturity level 2 and 3 until you actually completed stuff, everything at 1. So obviously those are things that we fixed since then. But one of the things in 2.0 that we've done as well is within each of these streams, the activities within them build on each other. And so they're more of a progression of maturity as you work through programs or work through those activities than they were before, where you would just have a bunch of things cobbled together that were loosely related. So one of the things that within SAMM right now, the primary method most people do assessments is what we call the toolbox, which is a fancy name for a glorified Excel spreadsheet with a whole lot of formulas built into it. Like it or hate it, it works well, honestly. It's portable. It does calculations for you. It has drop-down answers for you. It has the questions and then guidance. So there's guidance in here in terms of like what this question means. Like, what's the background behind it? What are you looking for? We're working on trying to build, a few people have done it internally. HP did it at one point. They had an internal tool for doing SAMM assessments, but it's aged, and I don't think it's actively maintained right now. So we've had a couple of other companies build one for themselves. One kind of has it exposed for public consumption if they want to use it. As part of the benchmark project that I'll talk about here in a minute, we're looking at, or I'm responsible for that. So we're looking at building essentially a web app to be able to let you either fill out the questionnaire there or be able to upload results, so that you can contribute to overall and then be able to see like where you stand in the grand scheme of things. So the other thing SAMM helps you, the toolbox has built in, is we have these really neat dashboards. So that'll also give you some idea, like within these different practices, how well are you doing? You know, where do you have gaps? Where are your strong suits? Helps you identify, sorry, helps you identify places to improve, opportunities. Who tested the Q&A? Sorry, I got distracted by a question. My kind of question, who tests the SAMM Q&A? To find trouble. Can you elaborate on that real quick, Mike? Maybe? Or I can answer that later too. Oh, I'll answer that later, I suppose. So trying to get SAMM in place, so you may, depending on your backgrounds and what you've been getting into, some of these may be common sense to you and you already know. If you haven't yet, one of the most critical things is to get buy-in from stakeholders. You have to convince them that this is in their best interest as well. Otherwise, without cooperation from them, it's going to be a really difficult road getting in there. Then you basically, it's a risk-based approach. So you can't say no all the time. So you have to figure out what makes sense for your organization. Where is the highest risks to what you consider most valuable in your org? Awareness and education is absolutely a foundation. When I was at FedEx for running their AppSec group, we went through and trained not just all the developers, but we ran secure development training for all the project managers and managers, because we needed their support when a developer showed up and said, I need time to do this, or I need to be able to include the security control. I needed the project managers and the developer managers to understand why. Why did they need that support? Why were they asking that kind of question? And then trying to, you know, as much as you can, integrate security. So we used to, and this was a flaw on AppSec's part for a while, we used to draw like parallel processes and say, here's your development process and here's your security process, and you need to do both or somehow overlay them. But really what it comes down to is trying to figure out what developers are doing in their process, and then just get them to add 15 minutes here, 10 minutes there, update a process, update an activity, so that they can it becomes part of their regular routine. And then being able to measure, providing visibility to management in terms of why this is a benefit. Because honestly, and it's tough as a security guy to say this, every dollar you spend on security is a dollar you don't spend on business functionality or something like that. So you need to be able to just provide, you know, some measurable benefit in terms of what kind of improvement for their investment in security. Otherwise, you have to do it by like FUD, the fear, uncertainty, doubt, or you have to just say, trust me, I'm like an insurance policy. We'll never know what I ever saved you, but, you know, don't take the risk of not giving me money. So I'm usually a big proponent of trying to figure out, like, how do we measure that we've improved because of this? So now, given it's been, 10 years or so since they originally split, SAMM can still sort of map to BSIMM, or at least the 1.5 did. We've got a bit of a difference now in 2.0 now that we now have 15 practices instead of 12. But I went through, I forget if it was BSIMM 9 or 10. So I went through the detailed document and then compared what, like, the questions they were asking and what they were looking for compared to what SAMM was doing at that level. And if you go all the way down to the individual questions, we've diverged about what we're asking about. At the highest level, you can see the parallels between the two spider charts. At the highest level, you're looking at design analysis versus architecture analysis, implementation review versus code review. They're actually quite similar at the highest level. So there are people that would run their SAMM scores and then try and compare it against BSIMM. One of the criticisms of BSIMM is because of the way it's marketed and who actually uses it, it's more a measurement of the elites in terms of the top few percentage of organizations. The ones that can afford to pay for it and the ones that want to be part of that group. And yeah, the cost barrier for BSIMM has been big. I've had a number of clients that are like, we just simply can't afford to get into that kind of stuff. But then we've had others that they're like, we did it because we want to be part of the conference. We want to be part of, the community that BSIMM is. And I have to hand it to Cigital and then Synopsys, is they've done a really good job at marketing it. They are right now the only real way that you can compare your program to somebody else. But it's really mostly for, I don't want to really say upper tier, but it's definitely for a certain subset of organizations. So the hope with SAMM is to be able to, especially with the benchmark project coming, to be able to provide that for everyone else. So to be able to say, hey, you know what, you can do it yourself. You can hire one of multiple consultancies that will help you do SAMM in your organization. And then there's a way for you to be able to contribute those results and be able to compare yourself with other similar organizations. And that's where benchmark's coming in. So benchmark is the number one question that we've had in benchmark is, how do I compare? That is just, it's human nature. And to be honest, that's like how executive management works, right? So you're like, this is great for us, but how do we compare against our competition? How do we compare against people in our industry, people of a similar size, geographic origins, stuff like that. So what we're trying to do with benchmark is, the idea is to collect the most comprehensive data set for organizational maturity. So ideally, there's the grand vision is that both from self-assessments and from third-party assessments, so consultancies that can contribute assessments that they do for other parties, that we can put those together into a data set. And then we can start looking at what's working and what's not working. So right now, the model is built off of a wide, varied experience of a bunch of different people. Some work in-house, some are consultants, and about what works and what doesn't. But we don't really have a lot of hard data for that. And we don't have a place for people to be able to say, hey, I tried doing this type of control with this type of culture and SDL, and it just flat out doesn't work. And this is what we tried to do. Being able to share those stories and those experiences, there just really isn't a platform for that right now that I know of. So the idea for this, because people get sensitive about this data, and it's interesting, my opinion is, I don't think anybody's going to target your organization that it hadn't already because you had a 1.2 in operations. I think they're probably going to use better things, triggers to try and decide whether or not to go for somebody. So, but at the same time, organizations are very careful about whether or not they're willing to contribute, how well they're doing in this space. So one of the reasons why it's taken Benchmark a while to get going is we've been trying to figure out how to solve the hard problems of how do we as a neutral third party build a system that can convince people that it's okay to share their data. So the idea is we'd be able to use OWASP's Azure cloud setup, be able to host and store data up there, but seriously limit who can actually have access to raw data. The idea is if you contribute scores from your organization or from different assessments, that you would be able to gain access to looking at a comparative analysis based on a bit of metadata from other organizations as well. So we also looked at this from a risk-based perspective in terms of what level of risk a company is willing to put in. So scenario one is the submitter is known and they're totally fine with being identified as a contributing party. So this is similar in many ways to BSIMM. So in BSIMM, you will see that there's only a subset of the companies scored will actually put their name down within the BSIMM report so that people know that they've gone through it. So some people may be totally fine with doing this with SAMM, and some may decide that say, hey, you know what? I'm okay being known, but I don't want to be publicly recognized or listed. So what that means is that's a different level of risk. So we would store your results within the database, and it would be linked to like a primary contact that manages the scores and such. And so you could figure out which company they came from. The third scenario is the core SAMM team knows who submitted so that we know it's verifiable, but we don't actually put it in the database. So there is essentially a dummy organization that is put in there for them. And so we know it's verifiable data. It's not just random stuff that somebody may or may not have made up, but we don't actually store that in the database. So if for any reason somebody manages to somehow get access to the raw data, they still can't determine who it actually is. And the fourth scenario is that the submitter is actually completely anonymous. I'm not crazy about this scenario, but I don't totally understand that some organizations may be only willing to contribute data if they're 100% anonymous. So we want to support it. However, when the idea is when we go through and try and do the comparisons, there will be an option for whether or not you want to include unverified data. Because if the SAMM core team honestly has no idea who it came from, we can only put so much weight behind the quality of that data. And so then we'll leave it up to the users, excuse me, leave it up to the users to decide whether or not they want to include that data within the comparisons. So right now we're starting like the initial data set. So I'm working on the application, the design of it. The data model's pretty well set at this point. So really sending me, if you have any examples, you can send them to me and I can use them to do some of the initial seeding. We're planning to have the ability, the app would have the ability to have a web-based, similar to the toolbox, web-based questionnaire where you can fill it out. If you allow us to store who you are, you can come back and you can manage it and update it over time so you can see trends. And that's where I think you'll see most of the values. You can see how things change over time. Ideally, I would love to be able to do reporting on your velocity or whatever buzzword you want to use in terms of how people are improving over time. Which areas are companies focusing on, what seems to be working well, that kind of stuff. We've also looked at, or I'm looking at trying to allow the Excel spreadsheet to have the ability to call an API and submit results from the spreadsheet so you don't have to go through extra steps. So within the data structure, I know this gets small. Small advantage of using Zoom is you can actually look at it on your own screen and you're not trying to stare at it 30 feet away from a projector. So what we're trying to do is collect data elements related to an organization to be able to do reasonable comparisons without totally outing a company within a certain area. So, you know, looking at whether or not it's a self-assessment or a third party, geographic regions, primary industries. From the SAMM user day, we had some feedback. Is like, since we're going to have multi-language, it might be useful to have, if people are willing to tell us whether or not, you know, was this done from an English translation, a Spanish translation. The data model is abstracted to the point that we can actually store and manage, that you could compare multiple SAMM versions. And then we've also realized that the interesting thing with SAMM is it's sometimes some people use it per team, and sometimes they use it per department, and sometimes they use it per organization or business line, and sometimes they do it for the entire company. I've seen all different ranges, and so some of the feedback we got was like, I'd really like to know if I'm comparing scores, I want to try and get as close to apples as I can. So I want to know if what happens if I look at organizational levels versus team levels kind of thing. And then we're just looking at ranges, because to be honest, I don't need to know you have 642 or 643 developers. That really doesn't matter, and you don't have the time to try and get that exact number. So going for accuracy over precision, I'm more in favor of providing ranges. And so we're looking at like the different ranges that would make sense. And then primary SDL methodologies, because I expect scores to be different and activities that you're working on to be different depending on SDL methodologies you're working on. So some of the links, right about where I wanted to be. So some of the links we have, so we just had, last week, we had SAMM User Day. So you can go look on YouTube. OWASP SAMM has a channel there now. And so there's the entire user day, which is almost 8 hours of a video. But they're working on slicing out all the individual talks into individual videos. So you can go through and see what's going on there. We have a separate site. For better or worse, OWASP setup was just a little too restrictive for what we wanted to do. So we have a project page on OWASP, but the main site is owaspsam.org at this point. Almost everything we're working on is in GitHub, so you can find it there and just see some of the stuff. You can also find some of the historical things. OWASP Slack, we have a Project SAMM channel, so you can also go in there, ask questions, see where people are doing. We have a monthly newsletter as well for people to sign up. And then if you've got time, donate resources, donate data, feedback. I've gotten some good feedback from working with SAMM. So in the last few months, I've been working with CIS, the Center for Internet Security, and they have a process called RabbitV that they're working on. And it's for basically trying to create standards for non-voting technologies. So things like poll books, election night results, tallies, that kind of stuff. Things that don't directly collect a vote from somebody. And as part of that process to assess and verify the company and the software product, we have, SAMM is the core of the process assessment part of it. So I've been working with them to get that embedded and set up. And working there. So from doing that, I've actually gotten some good feedback from some folks that, looking at it from a different lens, they're like, this is really great, but you're talking about software assurance, and there's some activities that aren't 100% security typically that also add to the level of assurance of your software in terms of the reliability, the quality, and that kind of thing. So that's been super useful. But that was it for the slide deck. And that's right about where I wanted to be because I wanted to be able to field questions. So if you have questions, by all means ask them. I also answer questions related to top 10 if people have those as well.
Hey, Brian, I got a question. This is Scott.
Yes.
I know we've talked a couple times on LinkedIn and after the OWASP SAMM. One thing I'm curious about, like I've been part of BSIM, right? And it's great that, if you can spend the money, getting connected with resources and things like that, and also see what other people are doing is awesome. It's not really reflected in the data, but that's a good side part of the community. So I'm excited to see that aspect within OWASP, especially if we can get like maybe a Slack channel or something out there and leverage that, tie it together with
Yeah.
things. But have you seen SAM used more or less like in practices that might be siloed within an organization? I mean, BSIM and SAM are mostly reflective of a centralized security group, but I think we're starting to see a lot more of that decentralization in like DevOps practices.
Mhm.
But the capabilities that they're providing, education, testing, things like that, maybe that's a way for an organization with a large siloed approach to be able to compare and pull together other ones. Because that's,
Yeah.
typically what I see in BSIM or SAM is how do I measure against others, and others can be defined different ways to try
Mhm.
to get more similarity or learn where others are making improvements and I need to maybe come up to their bar.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've seen it. So I've seen it a couple of ways. I've seen it within a large organization. They basically made logical separations. And so, like business units, individual business units, each ran their own. So we ran like 12 individual scores for each of their business units and then one overall score. I've have somebody who reached out to me a couple days ago. They're saying within their company they've split their company into 7 different areas. So they've run full SAM on 7 areas, and they were curious if we'd prefer 7 individual data sets or one conglomerate. Honestly, I'd rather have the more granular level. I've seen, and that's part of the reason why I think we've gotten the feedback also to include the scope of the assessment. So traditionally, what I've seen is for a lot of organizations, a lot of times the governance business function ends up being similar because that's done at a different level, a much higher level than individual teams. But then they also will run scores for the implementation, the verification, and the design at an individual team level. And sometimes I know um, uh, Denim Group used to do their assessments all the way down to an individual dev team level, and then they could put them together. I've seen them just at a number of different logical levels. Sometimes it's at like a VP's group or a director's group, stuff like that. I've actually been kind of surprised at the variation of how people actually perform um, SAM assessments in terms of the sizes of the org. When I first started, I usually just considered it for like a single company at once. But I'm seeing it used a lot of times at much more granular levels. I hope hopefully that helps answer.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. Thank you.
So if no one else has any other questions, the top 10, uh, basically because of COVID and the fact that people have other priorities and the core teams had other priorities as well, just like everyone else, we've pushed it out a little bit. So rather than having the data call be over already, because we hadn't gotten much at all, so the data call is actually open right now. I've had several contributions working on setting up essentially the analysis for it. So what we're gonna try and do this year, instead of doing just Excel, we're going to actually have a full data model and run it through Power BI and see what other things we can come out with it. The idea is hopefully, if it works out the way we did, so in 2017 we had 117,000 apps in the data set, 114,000, something like that. We're hoping to have more this time around, which I think would probably make it one of the largest data sets known in terms of vulnerability distributions within different types of applications. So what we wanted to be able to do is beyond the scope of just the top 10. So if you look at all the data we collect, we actually use a relatively small amount of the information you can glean from it to actually build the OWASP top 10. I think there's a lot more insight and a lot more information available from a data set like that. So the idea is we want to be able to support that and try and figure out what other things can we determine in terms of what vulnerabilities are trending in what directions, types of testing that find or don't find certain types of vulnerabilities more often, things like that. Hopefully, if we can get some decent data related to languages and frameworks, we can also start trying to figure out, like, are there certain framework testing combinations that find more of a certain type of vulnerability or don't? Just in general, trying to leverage our position at OWASP for being a neutral third party to try and help find stuff that benefits everyone else. So, but if anyone has anything else, you can send me a note. Gmail is probably easier than OWASP. I get to it more often. Most of my OWASP emails actually spam from China and India, so I have to wade through that to get the other messages, but I respond to both of them if anybody has any questions. But thanks for listening to me on your lunch hour. But I don't know, Chris mentioned he got pulled into something else. I don't know if somebody else, if there's closing or what at this point.
Yeah, I guess that's me. There's not a whole lot else going on. We do not have a talk scheduled for next month yet, I don't think. So if you know anybody that you would like to hear from, or you have a talk that you would like to give, please let us know. Thanks for coming out, Ryan, and talking to us. Unfortunately, I can't talk too much about this one because my boss manages BSIMM, so there's some conflicts of interest on this one for me. But
that's one of the advantages to being OWASP and university now, as I'm outside of some of that, so kind of makes things different.
Yep. All right. Thank you very much. If there's no other comments or questions from anybody else, I think we're all done.
All right.
Thank you, Brian. This was good.
Yeah, thank you very much.
No problem. You all have a good day.
Yep.
Have a good day.